No one wanted her. Not the
Another
town,
long
not the
road.
tribe, not anyone.
So much
She had
to
been left to
consider.
die alone, and the world had turned its back on her. Jack Miller stepped off his horse, the wind biting at his face as he looked at the dilapidated cabin. The door creaked as it swung open,
They're almost
revealing
here.
the woman inside. She was standing by the window, her face shadowed, her eyes
stand
hollow
together.
with defeat. She didn't even look up when Jack approached. "You're the one they abandoned?" Jack asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the ground. A small child clung to her side, their skin pale, their clothes tattered. Jack's chest tightened. This wasn't just about a woman left behind. It was about a family
You're
on the
surrounded,
edge of
cowboy.
survival. "What's your name?" he asked.
Not
The
yet.
woman's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah." Jack's mind raced. The town had given up on her, but he couldn't. Not after seeing what she had endured. The decision hit him like a wall. The townsfolk would never forgive him. Helping her meant breaking every rule they held dear. "I can't leave you here," he said. The tension hung thick in the air. Sarah finally raised her eyes, and Jack saw the raw vulnerability in them. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If you help me, they'll come for both of us." Jack looked around, the weight of the choice crashing down. The snowstorm outside raged, but the storm inside him was worse. Should he turn his back like everyone else? Or should he do what was right? "I'll help you," he said, stepping forward. The moment he reached out his hand, Sarah recoiled. She was afraid, but Jack knew he had no choice. It was either this, or let her suffer alone in the cold. But as his hand hovered above hers, the question burned in his mind. Would this simple act of kindness cost him everything? Jack rode alongside Sarah, the wind biting at their faces as they made their way through the thick snow. His heart was pounding, the weight of his decision pressing on him with every step. The town would never forgive him for this. They had made it clear, Apache women were nothing but trouble. But as Sarah's small, trembling hand rested lightly on the reins, Jack knew. There was no turning back. He glanced at her, trying to read her face, but she kept her eyes on the ground, her silence louder than any words. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, as if the world itself was closing in on them. "We need to keep moving," Jack said, his voice low. Sarah nodded, but there was a sense of fear in her posture. She wasn't just afraid of the cold, but of the world beyond this snowstorm. "They'll come for us," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jack didn't need to ask who they were. The people from the town, the ones who had cast her aside, who saw her as nothing more than a burden. But it wasn't just them. The land itself had turned its back on her. Jack's chest tightened. He had made a choice to help her, but now he was responsible for her life. What if it was the wrong decision? "If they come, we'll fight," Jack said, more to himself than to Sarah. The words felt hollow, as if they held no weight. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen if the town found them. They'd already made their intentions clear when they had turned their backs on Sarah. He could feel the pressure building in his chest. The world was starting to close in. But before he could say anything more, a noise in the distance made his heart race. A horse, then another, and another. They were being followed. Jack pulled Sarah closer to him as they rode faster, the sound of hooves growing louder. They were closing in. The risk of what he had done was now more real than ever. His mind raced. Should he keep running? Should he try to outrun them? Or was it time to face what he had started? He glanced over at Sarah, who was now gripping his coat tightly, her face pale. "Are they coming for us?" she asked, her voice quivering. Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. The decision was no longer just about helping her. It was about survival. The snow, the cold, the distant riders, they all seemed to blur into one growing storm. They weren't just escaping from the town anymore. They were running from everything. The past, the future, everything had caught up to them. The pressure was too much. "Hold on tight, Jack," ordered. Sarah clung to him as they sped through the snow, but the riders were getting closer. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with uncertainty. Jack's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The only thing that mattered now was getting them both out of this alive. But even as they rode, a question lingered in Jack's mind. Could he really escape the consequences of his decision? Or had he just started a chain of events that would lead them both into even greater danger? The wind howled louder as Jack and Sarah rode deeper into the snow-covered hills. The ground was slick, the air thick with the weight of a coming storm, but the worst was still ahead. Jack could feel it in his bones. He was no longer just helping a woman. He was stepping into something far bigger. The riders behind them had stopped chasing, but the silence only made the tension worse. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. "We need to keep moving," he said, glancing at Sarah. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. She wasn't just scared of the snow or the cold. It was the danger that came with her past. Jack had seen it in the way she spoke about the people chasing them, but what did they want from her? "They'll come for us," Sarah whispered, "and they won't stop." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of his decision to help her was too much to carry. But as they reached the crest of the hill, something in the distance caught Jack's eye. A group of riders, not just 2 or 3, but more than a dozen, moving fast through the storm. His heart raced. They were here. The world had caught up to him. He could feel Sarah tense beside him. She knew this moment was coming. "We can't outrun them," Jack muttered under his breath, pulling his horse to a stop. The riders were getting closer, cutting off any chance of escape. The stakes had never been higher. The moral choice he had made was no longer just about saving one person. It was about survival. The weight of responsibility crushed him. He could feel his grip tighten on the reins. Sarah was clinging to him, her hands shaking, but Jack couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. The riders approached with speed, and Jack knew the next few moments would decide everything. "We need to turn back," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. But Jack shook his head. He couldn't go back, not after what he'd started. "There's no turning back," he replied. The decision was made. But as the riders came closer, Jack had to make another choice. What if they couldn't fight their way out of this? What if he had to give them something more than just a fight? The question lingered, sharp as a knife, and the pressure was unbearable. What would he do if it came to that? The riders were almost upon them now, their horses pounding through the snow, and Jack knew he was running out of time. The decision wasn't just about what was right. It was about what he was willing to sacrifice to protect her. As he turned to face the incoming riders, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. What had he started? Jack tightened his grip on the reins, heart pounding as the riders closed in. His mind raced, every moment feeling like it would tear him apart. He had made his choice, but the weight of it was heavier than he expected. Sarah's fear was palpable. She pressed her face into his back, hands trembling, but it was more than fear of the riders. It was the fear of everything that had led to this moment, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being nothing in the eyes of the world. Jack had given her hope, but now he had to protect it. He couldn't let her down, not now. The riders were almost upon them. He could hear the thundering hooves, the sound of their approach impossible to ignore. The stakes were high, too high. He could feel the pressure building inside him, each second ticking by faster than the last. "We can't outrun them, Jack," Sarah whispered urgently, clutching at his coat. Jack's jaw clenched. "We don't need to outrun them," he muttered. "We need to face them." The words felt hollow, a lie he was telling himself. How could they possibly face this many? The riders were closing in, and there was no good way out. No easy way to fix the mess he had gotten them into. He was a cowboy, a man of the West, but this wasn't about the West anymore. This was about Sarah, about the injustice she had lived with, the injustice that he was now part of. He glanced back at her. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them, something fierce, something that told him she wasn't just a woman in need of rescue. She had fought this battle long before he had come into her life. "They won't stop," Sarah said, almost to herself. "They'll hunt me down until they get what they want." Jack felt a pang in his chest. He had no idea what they wanted, but he didn't care. He couldn't let them have her. His eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, to give them an edge. But the snowstorm made everything blend together. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had thought that by helping her, he was making the right choice. But now he was starting to realize how deep the consequences went. The town wouldn't forgive him for this. The people who had once called him one of their own would turn on him the moment they found out what he had done. But what if he didn't care? What if helping her was the right thing to do, no matter the cost? Jack's heart raced, but he pushed the fear away. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not when it mattered most. As the riders closed in, Jack turned to face Sarah. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her face a mask of determination. They would face this together. But the riders were still coming. And Jack didn't know how much longer they could outrun the truth. Would his choice save them? Or would it destroy everything he had worked for? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the riders came closer. The pressure was building, and Jack knew this was just the beginning. But what would happen next? Jack felt the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of his decision pressing harder with every passing second. The riders were closing in. He couldn't outrun them, but he couldn't stand still either. He looked down at Sarah, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide with terror. And yet, there was something else in her gaze. A flicker of trust. "You said we would fight," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling. "Wind, will you keep your promise?" Jack's heart ached at the question. She had put her faith in him, and now, it felt like a burden too heavy to bear. He wasn't sure what he had promised anymore. He had thought he was just helping her survive. But now, everything was changing. The riders were almost upon them. Jack could hear the pounding hooves, their shadows darkening the snow ahead. His hand tightened on the reins, the tension building. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about everything. He looked back at Sarah, her trembling hands gripping the saddle, her small body leaning into him for protection. Jack had been on the run before, but this was different. He wasn't running from the law or a fight. He was running from his own choices, from the consequences of helping a woman who the world had already decided was worthless. "Stay with me," Jack said, his voice low, his breath ragged in the cold air. But Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already with him. She had always been. And that's when it hit him. The choice he had made wasn't just about saving one life. It was about choosing to stand up for what was right, even when the world said it was wrong. The world had turned its back on Sarah, on people like her. But Jack didn't have to. He didn't have to be like the others. His choices didn't have to define him. He could still do something. "We'll make it," Jack said, more to himself than to Sarah. But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure. The riders were too close now. There was no easy way out. The stakes had never been higher. He could feel the weight of every decision he'd ever made crashing down on him. What had he started? The guilt gnawed at him. If anything happened to her, it would be on him. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice thick with regret. "I never meant for any of this." But Sarah didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with understanding, as if she had known this moment would come. "It's not too late," she said softly. Her words hit him like a slap in the face. She wasn't asking for him to fix everything. She was asking him to fight. For her. To fight for what was right. Jack looked ahead at the riders, then back at Sarah. The decision was clear now. He had to do whatever it took to protect her, no matter the cost. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know how they would survive. But one thing was certain, he would not turn back. He couldn't. "Stay close," Jack said, voice steady now, a new resolve burning in his chest. The riders were almost there. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he made his move. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a fight he could win. But he wasn't going to let her face it alone. And as they charged forward into the storm, the question remained, would they make it out alive? The riders were almost upon them. Jack could hear the pounding hooves, feel the tension building with every second. His heart was racing, but it wasn't fear that gripped him now. It was something else. A clarity. The kind that came when there was no more running. No more choices to make. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. "Stay close," Jack said again, his voice rough, steady. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a command. Sarah, her face pale, nodded without a word, but her grip tightened on his coat. She was ready too. They both knew this was the moment. The moment when their fate would be sealed. Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. The riders were here. His mind flashed back to the town, the faces of the people who had judged her. The ones who had turned their backs on her, called her worthless, forced her to hide in this godforsaken cabin. And here he was, standing beside her, facing the consequences of his choice. He could feel the pressure building inside him, a storm threatening to break. The moral weight of his decision had never been heavier. He had chosen to help her, but what if it was the wrong choice? What if he couldn't protect her? What if he couldn't fight the world that wanted to crush her? He looked ahead at the riders, their silhouettes cutting through the storm. The tension in the air was suffocating. There was no plan, no way out. His heart pounded louder in his chest, a drumbeat that matched the thundering hooves. "We don't have much time," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was clear now. He had put them both in danger. The weight of the world was pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something deeper, something that mattered more than his own life. He was fighting for her, for what was right. Jack's hand tightened around the reins. There was no turning back. Not now. Not when it mattered most. He felt the shift inside him. The decision had been made. He had already chosen his path. He wasn't going to run anymore. "We fight," Jack said, his voice low but firm. The words felt different now, like they held weight. He wasn't just saying them to reassure Sarah. He was saying them to himself. This was it. They couldn't outrun this. They couldn't hide anymore. The riders were almost upon them. And Jack knew that whatever came next, he would face it with her. The choice had been made. But as the riders closed in, a new question lingered in his mind. Would he have the strength to follow through? Would they survive this? The storm raged around them, and Jack knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The riders were closing in fast. Jack could feel the weight of every second, every breath. His heart was racing, the tension thick in the air. Sarah was clinging to him, but he couldn't focus on that now. He couldn't afford to. The riders were almost upon them. He had made his choice, but now the consequences were rushing toward him like a storm. Jack's grip on the reins tightened. He wasn't going to run anymore. He couldn't. The riders were here, and there was no escaping them now. The decision had been made. He had already chosen his path. "We fight," Jack said, his voice firm. Sarah's eyes flicked to him, a flicker of something. Maybe fear, maybe trust, passing between them. But Jack didn't have time to think about that. His mind was focused on one thing now. Survival. He drew his gun. It was a simple motion, but it felt like the world had shifted with it. The riders saw it too. They weren't stopping. They were going to charge. Jack could feel his pulse quicken as the distance between them closed. This wasn't just about protecting Sarah anymore. It was about making sure the injustice she had lived with didn't follow them. He wasn't going to let them take her, not after everything. As the riders bore down on them, Jack moved. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. With a swift motion, he fired into the air. The sharp sound rang out, and for a split second, everything went still. The riders stopped. The horses reared up, their riders hesitating, uncertain. Jack's eyes locked on them, his heart thumping in his chest. They were waiting for him to back down. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had made his choice. There was no turning back. "We won't be your victims," Jack said, his voice cold and steady. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The riders were looking at him, sizing him up, but Jack didn't flinch. He was ready for whatever came next. The moment stretched on. The riders were silent. But then one of them spoke. "You think you can protect her? You're just as dead as the rest of us." Jack's grip on his gun tightened. The words cut through him, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of death. Not now. Not when it came to doing what was right. Sarah's life was worth more than his own. The riders were still there, but they weren't moving. The silence between them felt like an eternity. And then, without warning, Jack made his move. He took a step forward, gun still in hand, eyes locked on the riders. The message was clear. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The riders hesitated for a moment, and in that moment, Jack knew he had made the right choice. But the question still lingered in his mind. What would they do next? The riders hadn't backed down yet. Would they fight? Would they retreat? The tension was unbearable, and Jack could feel it tightening around him. He was standing at the edge of something bigger than he ever expected, and there was no telling what would happen next. Jack stood firm, the riders now just a few feet away, their presence like a wall of tension. His hand was steady on the gun, but his heart was pounding harder with each passing second. The moment he fired, he knew there was no turning back. The riders were still unsure, but their hesitation wouldn't last long. He could feel Sarah's breath against his back, her presence a constant reminder of the weight of his choice. He had made a stand. Now he had to follow through. The first rider spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this is over, cowboy? You think we'll let you walk away from this?" The words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken truth. Jack had crossed a line. There would be no easy way out now. The wind howled around them, the snow falling heavier, the storm matching the fury brewing between them. Jack knew they were closing in, watching for any weakness. He couldn't afford to show one. "You're making a mistake," Jack said, his voice clear and steady, but the tension in his chest was almost unbearable. Sarah shifted behind him, a soft gasp escaping her lips. He turned his head just slightly, meeting her eyes. She was afraid, but there was something else in her expression, something that told him she was ready to fight, too. The riders were circling now, almost like wolves. Jack's fingers tightened around the gun, but his mind was racing. They couldn't fight all of them, could they? They didn't have a plan. They didn't even have a way out. The pressure was mounting. They were trapped. Jack's eyes darted around, looking for anything, any advantage. But the storm was making it hard to see, and the riders knew the land better than he did. This wasn't his home. This was their territory. Jack had to make a decision now, stay and fight, or try to run. But could he really run? Could he leave Sarah behind, knowing what she had already been through? His heart pounded in his chest as the riders closed in even tighter, their faces obscured by the snow and their intentions unclear. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. "We don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice still firm, but now with a plea beneath it. He wasn't afraid to fight, but he was afraid of what might come after. Would this end with bloodshed? Would it end with both of them dead? Or would the riders back down? Sarah's hand gripped his arm tightly. She was with him. But even that wasn't enough to fight the reality of what was happening. The riders stopped circling, and Jack could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to make a move. The moment stretched, and for a brief second, Jack thought he might find a way out. But then the leader of the riders spoke again, his voice full of certainty. "You made a mistake, cowboy," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And now you'll pay for it." The words hit Jack like a blow to the chest. There was no way out now, no way to avoid what was coming. The storm wasn't the only thing closing in. The riders were too close, and Jack could feel the heat of their gaze on him. He had made his decision. Now he had to see it through. Would they fight to the end? Or would something else change the course of their fate? Jack didn't know, but he was ready to find out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. What would he do next? Jack's chest tightened as the riders closed in. The leader of the group was staring at him now, his eyes cold and full of certainty. "You've made your choice, cowboy," the leader said, his voice low but full of menace. Jack's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet. I'm not afraid of you," Jack said, the words coming out harder than he expected. His heart was racing, but his voice stayed steady. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. The snow swirled around them, thick and relentless. Jack could barely see the other riders, but he could feel their presence, feel the danger growing with every breath. "You should be," the leader replied, his grin cold and dangerous. The tension in the air was unbearable. Jack knew that the moment they made a move, everything would change. The riders weren't backing down, and he couldn't back down either. Sarah's grip tightened on his arm, her fear palpable, but there was something else in her eyes now, something more than just fear. There was a flicker of hope, a flicker of trust that Jack couldn't ignore. He couldn't fail her. Not now. Not when they had already come this far. The storm was closing in, the riders were closing in, and Jack felt the pressure building. To a breaking point. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They had no choice but to face what was coming. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away," Jack said, his voice hard. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get to decide that," he sneered. The riders were getting closer, their faces twisted in anger, their hands gripping their weapons. Jack could feel the air crackling with tension. He had made his decision, but now he had to live with it. He had to stand by his choice, no matter the cost. But as the leader gave a signal, the riders began to move, their horses charging forward. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He had one shot at this. One chance to protect Sarah. He couldn't hesitate. Not now. Without another word, Jack spurred his horse forward, heading straight for the leader. The riders followed, but Jack's eyes were locked on one thing. One goal. Protecting Sarah. The moment he made his move, everything changed. There was no turning back. His heart pounded louder, but he didn't care. He was in the thick of it now, and he wasn't going to back down. The tension was unbearable as the riders closed in, but Jack was determined. He was ready for whatever came next. But as they neared each other, Jack's mind raced. Would this be enough? Would they survive this? Or was he about to make a decision that would cost them everything? The riders charged, their horses thundering towards Jack and Sarah. The snow whipped around them, blurring everything but the storm of horses and men headed straight for them. Jack's heart raced, the pressure in his chest growing unbearable. This was it. The moment he had feared and prepared for. The moment when his choice would come to define everything. The leader of the riders raised his arm, signaling the attack. Jack didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, meeting the charge head-on, adrenaline surging through him like fire. He wasn't backing down. Not now. He had made his decision, and he wasn't about to let the world take it from him. The riders closed in, but Jack wasn't focused on them. His eyes were locked on the leader, the man who had forced them into this corner, the man who had made him choose between his life and what was right. Sarah was behind him, her presence a reminder of everything he stood to lose. She was depending on him. He couldn't let her down. The riders were just a few feet away now. Jack's fingers tightened on his gun. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for everything he believed in. Stay close, Jack yelled over the wind, but he didn't know if she could hear him. It didn't matter. He couldn't afford to turn back now. He couldn't afford to doubt his decision. The leader lunged forward, his weapon raised, and in that instant, Jack felt his pulse stop. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything had led to this. Would Jack choose to kill, to end the threat in front of him, or would he take the risk of letting them go? The tension in the air was suffocating. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of his choice hanging over him like a guillotine. The wind howled louder, the snow blurring everything in sight. The world felt small, reduced to this one moment. Jack's hand twitched, his gun still aimed at the leader. His mind raced, his heart beating in his ears. What was the right thing to do? He had already decided, but now, with the weight of the world bearing down on him, the gravity of his choice felt almost too much to bear. The leader was closing in. Jack had to act, and he had to act fast. But something stopped him. A memory. A flicker of doubt. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't like them. He had a chance to make things right, to protect what mattered. You want me to kill him? Sarah's voice cut through the storm, full of fear but clear and strong. Jack looked back at her, his heart hammering. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else in them. Something that made Jack hesitate. What would you do? She asked. The question hung in the air, thick with meaning. Jack knew what he had to do, but could he live with it? The tension surged again, more powerful than before, and Jack felt the weight of his decision settle in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the right to live, to choose. And as the riders neared, one question still burned in his mind. Would he survive the decision he was about to make? The moment stretched, the wind howling louder as the riders advanced. Jack's heart thundered in his chest, every second dragging on like a lifetime. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of his decision looming over him. He had chosen to fight, to protect her. But what if it was all for nothing? What if the cost was more than he could bear? The leader of the riders didn't flinch. He stared Jack down, confident that his power and numbers would break him. But Jack held firm. Then, in an instant, Sarah's voice broke through the tension. Jack, she whispered, her voice filled with urgency. He turned to her, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the fear in her eyes. You don't know who they are, she said, her voice shaking. Jack's breath caught. What did she mean? The riders were closing in, and yet, it was her words, not the threat of the riders, that froze him in place. Sarah's gaze was steady now, unwavering. They're not just here for me, she said. They're here because of what I'm carrying. The world seemed to stop. Jack's mind raced, but he couldn't grasp the gravity of her words. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low, filled with disbelief. Sarah took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she lifted it to her chest. I'm the last of the McAllisters, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was forced to hide, but I carry the map to the hidden land, the land that belongs to my people. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The land, the Apache land. It all clicked into place. The riders weren't just after Sarah. They were after something far more valuable. Jack had been protecting more than just a woman. He had been protecting the key to everything. The realization hit him hard, but there was no time to process. The riders were still closing in. But now, Jack knew the stakes were even higher. The moral choice he had made wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving the land. And if they failed, the consequences would be far greater than just their lives. As the leader of the riders raised his weapon, ready to strike, Jack made his decision. He wasn't going to let them take her. He wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully hers. With a quick motion, Jack pulled his gun and fired into the air. The sound was deafening. The riders froze, their eyes wide in shock. Jack's heart raced, but his resolve was unshakable. The tension in the air was thick, but now, Jack was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the future, for something bigger than himself. The riders hesitated, but the leader's voice cut through the silence. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He had made his choice. He had chosen to protect the land, the future. But what would the riders do next? Would they back down? Or would this lead to something far worse? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Jack faced the moment of truth, his last stand. The riders hesitated, their faces twisted with confusion, uncertainty creeping in as Jack stood his ground. He had fired, but it wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration, a promise that no matter the cost, he would not back down. The tension was thick, and for the first time, the leader of the riders faltered. His gaze flickered from Jack to Sarah, and Jack saw the realization in his eyes. Sarah wasn't just a woman in hiding. She was something far more valuable. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his stance remained firm. The riders were no longer charging. They were waiting, evaluating, but Jack knew what had changed. It wasn't just the land they wanted. It was Sarah's strength, the legacy she carried. "I'm not afraid of you," Jack said, his voice steady. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You think you've won? We'll come back. You can't stop us." Jack didn't flinch. "I've already stopped you." And in that moment, Jack saw the shift. The riders pulled back, their weapons lowered, and the tension slowly began to dissipate. The storm outside seemed to calm as if the world itself was acknowledging the change. Jack turned to Sarah. Her eyes met his, filled with something new, something that had not been there before. Gratitude, strength, and, for the first time, a hint of peace. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "You saved me," she said, the weight of her words settling between them. Jack could feel the heaviness in his chest lift. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about fighting the riders. It was about the future, about what they could build together. But even as Jack stood there, relief washing over him, he knew it wasn't over. Not really. The riders might have left, but their threat still loomed large. Sarah was free, but her fight wasn't finished. Jack glanced around, his thoughts racing. He had saved her, but what would they do next? Where could they go from here? The land was still there, and the legacy Sarah carried was more than a map. It was a future that Jack was now a part of, whether he was ready or not. The weight of it all settled in, but there was no turning back. Together, they would face whatever came next. Sarah's hand reached for his, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "We'll build something better," she said, her voice soft but full of certainty. Jack nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. The end of one battle, the start of another. And as the storm raged on outside, the two of them stood together, ready for whatever came next. But the question remained, what would the world throw at them now? Jack stood at the edge of the hill, the cold wind biting at his face, but the weight in his chest had lifted. The riders were gone, their threat fading into the distance. Sarah stood beside him, her presence more than just a comfort. It was a bond, a shared understanding of everything they had been through together. The world around them felt different now. The air was clearer. The storm was still raging, but for the first time, it felt like they were in control. Jack glanced at Sarah, her eyes softer now, filled with a new kind of strength. She had been through so much, yet here she was, standing tall, standing beside him. The choice he had made, the one that had seemed so impossible at first, had changed everything. He had chosen to fight for her, for what was right. And now, the world had shifted. He felt it in his bones. The future that had once seemed so uncertain now seemed possible. Together, they could rebuild what had been broken. Jack's hand brushed against hers, and for the first time, the weight of everything they had endured didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something they could carry together. The land, the legacy, everything Sarah had fought for, it was now in their hands. And Jack was no longer just a cowboy. He was a part of something bigger, something that mattered. "We'll make it," Sarah said, her voice steady, but there was an unmistakable note of hope in it now. Jack nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected, peace. The choice he had made had brought them here, and it was the right choice. But as they looked out over the land, the question still lingered in the back of his mind. Would the world accept them? Would they be able to hold on to what they had fought for? The storm wasn't over. Not yet. But together, they would face whatever came next. Jack looked at Sarah, and for the first time in a long time, he saw a future. A future that was theirs to shape. But as they turned to face the challenges ahead, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. Would they succeed? Or would the forces that had torn them apart come back to destroy everything they had built? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as they walked side by side into the uncertain future.